A few years ago, I found myself in Paris, not Paris, Texas, like the Paris. And I had an opportunity to go. I went to the Louvre. I went to the Museum d'Orsay. Anybody heard of that? Anybody art people? Yeah, a few art people. I am not an art person. I do not have those kinds of abilities, that kind of creativity. I just don't think that way. I can appreciate some things for what they are, but there's a whole layer of stuff that's lost on me. And so I remember being at this world-renowned, like one of the top 5 art museums in the whole world, and I'm just walking around floor to floor. I'm like, that's awesome. That's awesome. Oh yeah, there's another naked lady, and when I was making my way out, there was this lady on her knees crying, holding her husband's hand and going, "Oh, have you ever seen anything so magnificent?" And I'm like squinting at the picture she's looking at, like trying, what am I missing? And, and I'm like, I'm just an Okie from Muskogee, And there's just a truth that she, because of her understanding of art, the time that she spent with it, her understanding of the time period and the techniques and the way that it was put together, she could actually see things that I couldn't see. She could appreciate things that I couldn't appreciate. She wasn't just eccentric where I'm more realistic. That wasn't what was going on. She just had attuned her mind and heart to see and appreciate what was in front of her. And that's what I think, we haven't talked about this a whole lot, Arliss, but that's what I think the intent of this series is to let the Bible be unleashed for what it was intended to be. We have systems that we often try to impose on the Bible, ways of reading it to make it easier, to make it simpler, but rarely do we get to just unleash it. Just let it hit you for what it is. And I don't mean just reading it from left to right. I mean having an appreciation for who it was written to and the form that it was written in. We're just not very good at it. Our hearts, our minds are not attuned to that. Even if we're Spirit-led people, the Spirit does not always just jump over those things. It just doesn't. This is an intimidating topic for me. I went to seminary, I got to go, and you don't become an expert in seminary. You just don't. What I can tell is when people know what they're talking about and when they don't. And we were so gifted last week when Emily was teaching, because I'm like, she knows what she's talking about. She goes beyond just like, oh, I have an idea of what this is doing, to like, I actually love the text. I love the Bible. And there's just such a gift to have someone in here that loves the Bible. It reverberates down to us. But I'm going to talk about, I've been asked to talk about the prophets and apocalyptic literature today. That is a huge topic. Oh my goodness. I was so intimidated to be given that. I mean, where do you even start? And so when we talk about the prophets, and we're looking at it as where it fits in our Bible, we're generally talking about the 5 major prophets. So we're Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Lamentations. And they're not major because they're more important than the other prophets. It's just a larger set of text. And we're talking about the 12 minor ones from Hosea to Malachi. The prophets, if we're honest, it's not an area of the Bible that we're super comfortable with anymore. We do not see, there's not very many sermons on the prophets. You don't get that. The only time we utilize the prophets generally is when we're trying to show how it points to Jesus. So you'll get a prophetic sermon sometimes to show that the Bible is true, or that this is how everything led up to Easter, or this is how everything led up to Christmas. But we generally don't let the prophets speak for themselves. And if we're honest, we don't read the prophets. We just don't. We have a system that tells us what the prophets are supposed to do, And so we don't have to read them. We're like, oh, those are those books that point to Jesus. Oh, right? You ever think that? Oh, Isaiah, that's the one about Jesus. Like that. And so we don't actually, and I'm not saying it doesn't point to Jesus, because it does point to Jesus. They do. But that's not really unleashing the prophets for what they did and how they speak. Maybe you decided that you were going to tackle the prophets during your Bible reading time. Anybody, you get to some of these places and you fall off. Usually people don't make it past Leviticus. But let's say you've made it all the way and you're like, I'm going to read through the prophets this year, and many of you have, and you made it through that. And you're in your little quiet time in the morning and you're saying, God, speak to me. And you come across the prophets and they just lay into you. And the language is offensive and it's vulgar. And they're speaking about Israel's idolatry with such a salacious nature that you're just like, I don't like it for God to speak like that. I don't understand. That does not feel good. That does not feed me. That does not nurture my soul in the morning. And this, it changes things. Doesn't fit neatly. There are debates, and I don't want to get in these because they just don't matter for what the prophets are, but there are debates about how much of the prophet's language is the prophet and how much of it is God. They're not put together just in one neat fashion. So it's like, it's not just like every prophet went into a trance and spoke the word of God and God took over. Then that happens once or so, but that's not exactly what happens. It's not just as much the prophet dictates something and the scribe writes it down and it's straight there. There's a ton of evidence of these prophetic books being developed over time. The prophet's words being molded and shaped to speak to Israel's struggles and their current situations. I only say that to say this. The first thing we need to do is read the prophets. And when you read them, don't let the violent imagery make you miss the point. Don't let it even divide up. Like, sometimes we imagine the Old Testament God, and he's violent and angry and scary. And then there's Jesus, and he wants to give us a hug. And we if we just aren't careful, our reading of the prophets can cause us to do that too. It was meant to be uncomfortable. The prophets are meant to jar you. They're meant to go, oh, that does not feel good. It's meant to do that. We can't let it divide how we see God, because it's the same God screaming at us through the prophets to wake up, to turn around, as it is the same God who sends his Son to die for us. It's the same God. God, if you have any kind of basic Trinity idea, one God in three persons, and the three persons are united in will and purpose. They don't actually have different characteristics. They only have different characteristics when it comes to the economy of salvation, which means how God saves us. So they relate to us differently, the three persons of the Trinity, but they do not share different characteristics. Or you would have three separate gods, which is condemned. That's a bad deal. Or we commit the Marcionite error, which is that first, second century heretic, where it's like, oh, Old Testament God bad, New Testament God good. Let's just stay there. And we kind of functionally end up in that place. We just do. When we don't read the prophets, our senses get dulled. I recognize now, anybody know as they get older how selective your memory is? You notice that? I blame it on some concussions I had during sports. But I'm amazed all the time about the things that I don't remember. I just start thinking oh, when did that happen? Oh, I'm sure that did happen somewhere. But one of my memories from middle school was I was gearing up for a spelling bee. I don't know how many spelling bees I was in. I don't know why we had a spelling bee. But I knew I was going to win that spelling bee. I was in 8th grade. I'd practiced. I was determined. I go in. I make it pretty far. And some word trips me up. And this guy, Derek Austin, beats me. And my mom picks me up from school. And she goes, "You won the spelling bee, right?" Yeah. Yeah, I did. "Oh, congratulations. That's awesome." And then she dropped me off at the park to play. And she comes back and picks me up 3 hours later when she gets done with work. And she goes, "I called your grandma." And she is so proud. She's sending you a congratulations. "And I told your dad." Everybody is so proud of you, Baxter. And I was like, "Mom, I didn't win the spelling bee." And I thought she would go, "Oh, okay." I just thought it was kind of, in general, I feel like I was a pretty good kid. Mom, if you're listening to this, I was the favorite. I didn't have like this super rebellious stage, and we still have a great relationship today. And I thought she would be like, "Well, in light of all the good things you've done, this one's okay. Make it right." And she lost her marbles. That's why I remember it with my selective memory. She just lost it. Like this sin that I thought was so small that I could just say a quick apology for, she recognized it as this like threat to the person I was becoming. She was like, "I cannot believe you did this. Call this person and make it right now. Call this and make it right now." And she just lost it. And she wasn't okay. I've never seen her more disappointed in me. I've made bigger mistakes than that. But the prophets are like that. Things that seem like maybe aren't as big a deal to us, that we just cascade by and we get comfortable with, they're huge in the prophet's eyes. And they see where all that stuff's culminating. And when we don't read the prophets, our senses get dulled. We're always being tempted to baptize our actions and view ourselves as God's blessed people. We're always being tempted to go, "We're the good guys. Those people out there, those are the bad guys. Let's just have a moment of thanksgiving that we're the good guys." And that's just not the Bible story. That's just not it. And the prophets don't let us do that. We are prone to sentimentality. We judge ourselves based on our intentions, even if our intentions aren't very well thought out. We're like, "Well, I was trying. I don't hate poor people." The prophets see what our actions really do. How the shape of the community really looks. And they explode. There are lots of questions that the prophets are going to bring up for us. And those are supposed to come up in us when we read them. And you're going to get uncomfortable when you read the prophets, but just let the prophets do their work. Just let them do their work. Let them attune your senses to how God feels and what it means to have a relationship with Him. I guess, even though I just dove into the prophets, I think it would be important to have a conversation of what comes into our imagination when we think about what a prophet is. What do we think about when we think about a prophet? I know, for me, I grew up in some Pentecostal settings, and there were lots of people that I met that called themselves prophets. Quick YouTube search will pull me up some of those people. And generally, and a quick YouTube search will also pull up a bunch of people who view it as their job to just call out false prophets. What a miserable existence that must be. To spend all your time just talking to a camera or a phone and just being like, "Listen to me, those people are awful." I hate that. Maybe the general way I think we think about the prophets, we think about prophets is we imagine that a prophet's chief role is to tell us about the future. That's what we imagine when we think about the prophets. When we say something's prophetic, we generally mean, we think that that's future telling. And when we think about what are the prophets doing, we think that they're doing a bunch of predicting about Jesus. So we already have Jesus, so we don't need to go back and read about the predictions about Jesus. How boring would that be? Old Testament scholar John Goldingay, he says, a prophet is a scary person who mediates the activity of a scary God. I kind of like that. These are people that had an encounter with God that like literally knocked their socks off. In Isaiah 6, Isaiah meets the Lord, and he doesn't go, "Whoo, this is good." Like we do sometimes. We're like, "Oh, this feels nice in here. The Lord's in the house." He says, "Woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips." And Isaiah's the good guy. Like Isaiah is like, he is the righteous in his generation. And when he comes into contact with the holy God, he's convicted of his sin. He's convicted of the part of him that is not holy like God is holy. And it's only God that can bridge that gap. They're not generally people, when we talk about prophets, they're not generally people who were within the power structure of the time. They're not going to be working in the political sphere, though they might have a relation. They're going to have a relationship with these people. They're not on the king's payroll. And they're also, generally, they're not priests. They're not working in the temple. They're people that God has called from outside to be a voice crying in the wilderness. That's who these people are. I think about, we often think that when, like someone who's God's hands on is going to be successful in ministry. So you come across people, the first thing people ask me about Chi Alpha is they go, "How many people are you running?" First thing, every single time. And sometimes I'm proud of that number. And sometimes I go, But in their mind, and it doesn't really matter about me, but in their mind, we equate the blessing of the Lord with the outward success, the materialistic success, the visionary success of someone's work, what they lay. We imagine, whatever you lay your hands to, it's blessed. And there's some biblical echoes of that. But in general, when God calls somebody, he calls them to be faithful. He doesn't call them to look awesome. That's just not what he does. And so like Isaiah gets a call, and Isaiah's call is you're actually going to go to a people and they're not going to listen to you. In fact, your ministry's not going to be successful at all. Like it's going to be so bad. When he tells Jeremiah something similar, and he tells Jeremiah, like, I'm going to call you to go into powerful places and tell them that you're going to tear it down. And Jeremiah is a man of weak stomach. And he is like, oh. And so God has to say, I'm going to make your jaw so hard. I'm going to strengthen you. I'm going to make you able to do that. And still Jeremiah is just like, oh. When he says there is like a fire shut up in my bones, it is not some preacherism where it's like, oh, I'm so excited to be here. It's not like that. He's like, I hate this. And he ends up in a pit. He ends up in barracks. He ends up beaten. The prophets are not accepted in the time that they live, just almost generally, because they are uncomfortable people, miserable to be around people, because they just won't let it go. They're like my mom. She just wouldn't let it go. She wouldn't let it go. Baxter, you're the kind of guy that would lie. I know. Please let it go and think about all the good I've done. No. It's not fun. The prophets, when we think about who the prophets are, they go beyond just these books. In the Hebrew tradition, Moses is regarded as the greatest of the prophets. That's generally because of his intimacy with God, the exodus that he brought, like that God worked through him, and just the mediation he had between God and the people. He's considered the greatest prophet. And what's interesting is there's all these things like, and we'll read it kind of at the end, but there's all of these like things that are like, I'm going to raise up a prophet like Moses. And then there's this thing like, God never raised up a prophet like Moses. And you're kind of waiting. There's like all these people that are like awesome, but they just don't live up to who Moses was. And it gets us anticipating where the story's going. There's other prophets in the Bible, includes ones we know like Elijah and Elisha. They don't necessarily, in our canon, get like a book named after them or write in the same style. Nathan the prophet, right? You can think about Nathan the prophet. There's also female prophets. People like Huldah and Deborah and Miriam. I wish we could spend some time talking about who Deborah was and how she sat on the seat of Moses. And she was someone that was a judge and a prophet. Walter Brueggemann is an Old Testament scholar and theologian. And he says this about prophets. And I think when you're trying to think about who a prophet was, this quote really gets it for me. He says, for the most part, the prophets are not doing prediction, as many more conservative interpreters are wont to think. Nor, for the most part, are they social advocates, as many progressives choose to think. Rather, the prophets are emancipated imaginers of the alternative. They are emancipated from the dominant assumptions of their society because they know that the purposes of God cannot be contained in any such absolutizing assumptions. Man, we need the prophets today. We are so stuck in our ways of thinking. We are stuck in what's possible, what we can do, what's practical. When we imagine God, we can only do it in the framework of like evangelicalism. We can only look at God in the terms of conservative, liberal, woke, fascist, modern, postmodern. Our lenses are broke, and the prophets are able to step outside of that and say, no. God's bigger than that. God's bigger than the tradition of the assemblies of God. God's bigger, and God has some thoughts about your situation. And that's good, and it's scary. Remember, prophets? Scary people who have an encounter with scary God. My first point, I just got summary points. I preached a lot of my message already. I just got summary points about how this goes that I think helps us get a frame on this. Number one, the prophets are more focused on forthtelling than foretelling. If you were to read the prophets, they're speaking to a specific place and a specific time. And when we read the prophets, we can recognize that they're not written to us, but they are written for us. They're not written addressed to us. They're not like, oh, you Tahlequah, Oklahoman. But we can learn from them. It meant something to their time. So I know when we come to the text, we ask this question, what does this mean for me? Right? Is anybody, when you read the Bible, that's your question? That's my question. Like I do it. I want to know, what does this mean for me? But my first questions as a biblical interpreter has to be, what did it mean to the people who heard it first? Like I got to go, how did this speak to them in the way that it was communicated to be? Like I got to ask those questions. And it doesn't matter if you're an expert on it. Honestly, if you're asking that question, you are so far in the game. Like, go as far down as God gives you the excitement to go down. Be as nerdy as you were created to be. But if you just knew that was the question you were supposed to ask, rather than assuming that when I pick up Obadiah, It was a letter to Baxter Stewart, Andy, Shayla, and Luke. It's not first addressed to me. And I need to get my head in what it was saying and let it do its work. Let me imagine God in that way, and let my imagination be stoked by who God is and the story of Israel and where he comes. See, I'm a Gentile. Any other Gentiles in here? I'm grafted into the story. And I do not own the story. I only learned this from the story. I got grafted into a story that's bigger than me. The story did not start with me. The story was not written just for me. I do not control the story. I am a humble invite to the story. I got adopted into the story. So when we approach the Bible, and honestly, teaching does not make us humble. Teaching does not make me humble. It is a hard work of humility to submit yourself to God. But we are outsiders who let in. We cannot assume we are insiders. We act like insiders and gatekeepers sometimes. But it was the only true insider came to us and brought us in. And it's a story that we got to learn back and find ourselves in that story. We're not less than. When it says we're grafted in, they're not like Gentiles are worse than. It's not that at all. That's actually what Romans is about. That's a whole nother day. I'm grafted into a family and a story, and I need to humbly learn that story. And when we say that it's for a time and place, major events in Israel's story affect how that comes across. So the first just major event that happens is the northern kingdom falls to Assyria in 722 BC. So there's some prophets that are writing before and right as that's about to happen, and they're like, and there's some that write after, and it's shaped by these major cataclysmic events. Just like, you're not ready. Just like our modern day people that we listen to are shaped by our political events. I promise you, in the way that you read Revelation, it was shaped by the liberal and Republican kind of fights back and forth. And it's like, oh, Jesus has to be coming because a Democrat got elected. Again, you're not ready for that. It's shaped by these warnings. They're shaped by the fall of the southern kingdom when Judah falls to Babylon in 586 BC. It's shaped by the return to Israel. And then it's shaped by after they got there and they sat in there for a while and they go, is this really what we were promised? And that's in the context of people's hopes and dreams and expectations and their callings. The prophets speak. The way we arrange the books in our Bible, they're arranged in such a way that they accentuate who Jesus is. So, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, but the way we arrange our Old Testament and the way the prophets are arranged, they point us to Jesus, which is good. But the way that, it's the same books, but the way that, like, the Tanakh is put together, it's arranged differently, and it's arranged to see God's movement throughout the narrative of Israel's story. And so sometimes when we've rearranged them and we just read them left to right without any kind of guidance, we're kind of like, oh, we're here. Oh, we're here. Oh, we're here. Oh, we're here. And it's just like, it just doesn't make much sense to us. But when they were originally put together, and there's nothing wrong with ours, but when they were originally put together, and we have the tools to put this back together anytime, but when they were originally put together, they're put in a way that shows that God's doing something in narrative. So even things in the Bible that are not narrative are actually narrative. Like when we say the Bible is one story, even things that are like letter, or even things that belong to different genres, they're part of the story. And the way that the New Testament utilizes the prophets is different than the way. I think ultimately, the reason why we read the prophets the way we do is not our fault. It's the way the New Testament uses the prophets. And the freedoms that the New Testament takes and they have those freedoms. Like, there's things that like John can do with the prophets that I'm not allowed to do with the prophets. And they arrange them and to read them in light of Jesus and to show the legitimacy of Jesus and how he's connected in the fulfillment of Israel's story. But just because they could do that does not mean that's the only purpose of the prophets or even the main purpose for the prophets when they were written. And so I can look back and I can find Jesus, but that's still not the only thing. That's not even the main thing that the prophets were trying to do. You still with me? You still with me? Is this helpful? Somebody, just like, we need the teeth back in our faith. And the prophets give us some teeth. Because if without the prophets, I can kind of be tempted to go, I know what Christianity is. I know what the faith is, and I'm one of the good guys, and I'm just going to keep going. Sure, I make mistakes like anybody else, but I'm going to keep going. And the prophets go, no, stop. The prophets are primarily concerned with covenantal faithfulness. Israel's covenant with God, the people of God's covenant with God. In God's part, he's like, I'll be your God. I will bless you. I will dwell among you. In Israel, we will obey your commands, worship you alone, and live as your holy people. And so the prophets often work as kind of poetic lawyers, and they're like, you broke it. And then they could you imagine if you went to your lawyer and they started this 10-page poetry, just be, or you're in. But maybe you could imagine it, anybody Law and Order fans? Anybody? Yeah. Unfortunately, I got stuck watching that stuff when I was younger, and I continue on. It just, but you can see the closing argument sometimes and how poetic in nature and how riled up and emotional it gets. A lot of times that's what the prophets are doing. They're saying, you broke the covenant of God. You are guilty. And they're going through it. They're going through it, and they're going through it. And in the prophets, they spend so much time talking about idolatry, injustice, and their failure to trust God. Idolatry because they broke the covenant's worship obligations. Injustice because they've broken the covenant's social and ethical commands. And they've also perverted the shape of how God wants to be seen among the nations. This is why God is so concerned. We just imagine that God is so mad at the world out there and so in love with the world in here. Arliss goes like this sometimes. I'm scared. I'll find out later how many bad things I did. But the way this works is God calls a people to himself and says, I'm going to have a special relationship with you. You're going to get to wear my name. And the way the world sees you is how they're going to see me. And so therefore the prophets come and they say, you are not doing that. And God is blasphemed among the nations because of you. And so when prophets come, they come to the house of the Lord. There are a few exceptions. We'll talk about that in a second. But they're upset that the shape of who God is to the world, that God's trying to bring back together, is being distorted. And God cannot let that go on. They work in a way of kind of accusation, judgment, hope. Accusation, warning, hope. This is what you're doing. This is what's going to happen. If those that trust in me, you have some hope here. That's generally the shape of prophetic books. Point number 2, the last 2 are super short, so don't worry. Point number 2 is the prophets are more concerned with telling the truth than offending our sensibilities. And they're not, Elijah, they're not beloved in their time. Elijah is called the troubler of Israel. That's how the king thought of him. Will you please stop? Will you please stop? This is how they talk. I like the Message translation sometimes. I know Arliss does. One of the cooler things about him. And I used to make fun of it. I did. I used to think that's what weak people read, because it's not exactly a translation. It's more of a paraphrase. And then I kind of fell in love with Eugene Peterson, and things happened. But just sometimes what it does is it sets free like our language gap to catch something. And so just this is why people don't like prophets. Isaiah 1 verse 11 says, "Why this frenzy of sacrifices? Don't you think I've had my fill of burnt sacrifices, rams and plump grain-fed calves? Don't you think I've had my fill of blood from bulls, lambs, and goats? When you come before me, whoever gave you the idea of acting like this? Running here and there, doing this and that, all this sheer commotion in the place provided for worship. Quit your worship charades. I can't stand your trivial religious games, your monthly conferences, weekly Sabbaths, special meetings. Meetings. I can't stand one more. Meetings for this, meetings for that. I hate them. You've worn me out. I'm sick of your religion, while you go right on sinning." Doesn't this feel like it's for us? You know, when you put on your next prayer performance, I'll be looking the other way. No matter how long or loud or often you pray, I'll not be listening. And do you know why? Because you've been tearing these people to pieces, and your hands are bloody. Go home and wash up, clean up your act. Sweep your lives clean of your evil doing so I don't have to look at them any longer. Say no to wrong. Learn to do good. Work for justice. Help the down and out. Stand for the homeless. Go to bat for the defenseless. You see why people don't like them? Nobody wants to hear that. You don't want to, you come to church and you're like, I just want somebody to tell me I'm doing okay. And that's not what the prophets give us. These are people that just won't leave it alone. They're God's voice in the face of human indifference. We often think that, if you just told it to me nicer. Have you ever been offended by the way somebody told you something? How many times as Christians have we dismissed somebody's hurting because it had a cuss word in it? Or it came with anger? And they're more concerned with telling the truth than offending us. And we might say something like, if you told it to me nicer, I would respond. You ever found yourself saying something like that? If you told it to me in a way I could hear it, I would respond. No, we wouldn't. And that's why they do it. No, we wouldn't. This has gotten so bad that no, we would not listen to someone just being nice. Would you please they would not. We would not. We do not listen to that kind of thing. And so the prophets come as these radical poet actors. And they get asked to do things that are awful. You think about Hosea, marry the prostitute or the promiscuous woman, to show what, he's trying to put on display how, Israel's relationship with God. Or there's actually worse ones than that. Isaiah, go naked and barefoot for 3 years. Jeremiah, buy a ruined field. Ezekiel, lie on your side for a year. Ezekiel gets it bad. Ezekiel, cook food over cow dung. And they do it in public display for years. And it doesn't even really say that they are I'm doing this to tell you this. They're like provokers. Because the people are so hardened and dead in their sin that they wouldn't listen. And we get upset about our sentimentalities being offended, but we actually, we don't like how the message came to us, so we don't respond. And we're like, oh, if it came a different way, we would do it. If we just nicely brought that up in the board meeting. No, we would not. You know how it works. I remember I used to be the financial aid director at a college, and the person that got what they wanted is somebody that's like, Baxter, I'll kill you. If you don't give me my financial aid. there's a seriousness to their message to wake an asleep people. Last couple points, just real quick. I've already alluded to them. With a few exceptions, the prophets are sent to God's people. Like outside of Jonah, Nahum, and Obadiah, and maybe I missed some. In general, and they had specific purposes. I mean, they're even narrative in the narrative. Like, prophets come to the people of God to get our shape right. We wear the name. And we are responsible. We are called to something so much higher than the people that don't know Jesus. And prophetic voices will say, stop it. Wake up. Look where this is heading. Look at your idolatry. Look at how you've seen this through one way. And you're actually following money and not God. You're actually following politics and not God. You're actually trapped in a way of seeing things, and I need to liberate you from that so that you would actually start doing good again. That's what the prophets want to do, because they're like my mom. Nobody loves me like my mom. Nobody's ever loved me like my mom. And the reason why she got so upset is because she cared about where I was going. And it's that same loving God. He knows that we are not going to wake up, and he's just like, I cannot let it go on like this. And I worry, because sometimes our big fight in Pentecostal settings is to show that God still speaks today, right? You know, because I believe that. I believe that God still speaks today. But sometimes the stuff we call prophecy is not really the same thing. And this same thing is what God wants to do. But we've settled for something else because we're looking for something else. And I don't know why God does this, but when we don't open ourselves completely to him, he doesn't always give us more than we ask for. Like, it's kind of like when you don't, like, if you don't open your lens to who God is, he's not going to always break it open. And sometimes our imaginations are broken, and we can only see God through our paradigms. And so God is speaking, but we see it through the broken lens of our current moment. When he just wants to pull us out of that. Last thing, and I'll hand it back to Arliss. I already gave this point. Point number 4 is the prophets do point to Jesus. The prophets point to Jesus. Deuteronomy 18:15 says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, like Moses, from among you, from your fellow Israelites, and you must listen to him. And then you kind of think in the story it's Joshua, and then Joshua's not quite like Moses. And then like these later people come on and they're not quite like Moses, and there's no greater exodus like that's coming. But then, you know, I think Emily pointed this out. Then you get in the New Testament and there's all this kind of new Exodus language that happens. We kind of imagine it, like we just get so caught up in our Bible fights have hurt us. So we worked really hard to prove that the Bible is something that's serious. And so we worked really hard to take the literature part out of the Bible. We worked really hard to go, well, no. The Gospels are just these kind of biographies and eyewitness accounts. They are that, but they're so much more than that. They're these like retelling of Israel's story within the true story of Jesus. And so Jesus steps across. He comes out of the water, bringing the new Exodus for the people of God. Then in Deuteronomy 34:10, which is interesting. So, again, just messing with how these books get put together. If Moses is the only person that wrote Deuteronomy, how does he write something like, since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face? Because these books, and this isn't a problem unless you have some kind of weird view, that we had to put on to defend the Bible to people that were asking questions different than the ones they had back then. These were put together and arranged for the community of faith. And so they want you to know in this story that came from Moses that years went by And nobody came out like Moses. Because it's a story. It's a narrative that we enter into. And stories aren't, just because something is a narrative or a story, that doesn't mean it's not true or not real. It's actually more true in a lot of ways. Poetry is actually more real in a lot of ways. It's more poignant. It gets a hold of us. That's why you sing that song over and over again, and it connects with you on an emotional level. Because it's like, it's better than a self-help book. The Bible's better than that. Jesus is the fulfillment of the hope that the prophets, they laid down. So when they talked about there's going to be a day when God takes the law and he writes it on your heart, and he's talking about Pentecost Day. And he's using poetic language. He doesn't actually write the law on your heart, That Jesus came to give us the Spirit. He's the hope of our longings. And sometimes the thing that happened to Israel is they were hoping for something else. Because they weren't being they weren't attuning their hearts to God. They needed the prophets. That a lot of them missed it. Just like we miss it. We need the prophets. I hope that you would go on this journey and don't be afraid of it when it comes up in your Bible reading plan. We need wake-up calls. We need to think of God not as offended and angry, but as calling us back. Who can speak to the things that are hidden in our lives. You know what it's like to respond to God. You know what it's like to be in here, and even if it's something nobody knows about or something little that wouldn't affect anybody in here, knowing you got to run to the altar and make it right, and then when you get done, you got to go make it right out there. Something that maybe it was so menial that God convicted you about it. We need that kind of prophetic voice, and then we need that kind of voice over the shape of our church and where we're going that says, hey, is this kind of just pointing to you?